live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. So in this video, we're going to talk about the Cloudminders. So first off, I want to say, as someone who has spent a good portion of my adult life in West Virginia, this is an episode that really speaks to me a lot more than it necessarily did when I was a kid growing up in Western New York. Because Western New York, the Rochester area, does not have big mining culture, whereas West Virginia does. And this is an episode that really centers on mining, it centers on labor rights, it centers on the class struggle, etc., etc. So the Enterprise has to go to this specific planet, Ardana, in order to get Xenite. Ardana is apparently the only planet in the universe, as far as we know, that has Xenite, and Xenite helps to stop biological plagues. So basically this helps. So the issue is that there is a botanical plague, a plague of plant life on a particular planet. They need Xenite in order to combat it, and they need to get it there within a certain amount of time. The problem is, when the Enterprise gets to Ardana, the Troglodytes, who are the people who mine the Xenite, have decided that they are going to not deliver it. The Stratos City dwellers, particularly the council led by Placis, have promised that the Xenite will be there. The Troglodytes have decided not to deliver. What Kirk and Spock find out when they go down is that there's basically an ongoing class struggle between the Stratos City dwellers, who live in this city suspended in the clouds that's full of art and beauty and non-violence. And I put non-violence in scare quotes specifically, versus the Troglodytes, who live in the mines and who do the farming on the surface of the planet. Basically, they are the laboring class who supports the lifestyle of the class of people who live in the clouds. There is a particular disruptor, and that's the name that the Stratos City dwellers give to basically the leaders of the... It's not so much a labor union movement, but the equivalent in human terms, in U.S. terms specifically, would be a labor union, labor leaders. So the disruptors are sort of labor leaders. They do use more violence than labor unions typically have, although if you go back to, say, the Battle of Blair Mountain, it's not completely unheard of that pro-union groups might use violence in some way, usually defensive violence, if we're being honest. And it does seem like that is what the Troglodytes have done, because as we come to learn, the non-violent society of Stratos City depends on violence, as most ostensibly developed non-laboring societies do. Vana, the leader of the Disruptors, who has extensive interactions with Kirk and less so with Spock, Vana is captured. She's tortured. At one point, Placis gets really, really upset with Kirk because he's like, hey, don't torture people. And so Placis orders that if Kirk transports back down to Stratos City, he's to be killed on sight. So it's one of those things where this is clearly non-violent in the sense that the state has a monopoly on violence. There may not be interpersonal violence on Stratos City, but the state itself directly uses violence. So, Vana, for her part, wants not entirely clearly defined liberation for her people. She wants the Troglodytes to be able to live in the clouds the way the Stratos City dwellers do. Basically, she doesn't specifically lay this out in these terms, but basically she wants the abolition of class differences, a social leveling to eliminate the gap between the sort of wealthy and non-productive class versus the exploited productive class. Spock lays this out in some very clumsy voiceovers that, interestingly enough, I never remember from when I was watching this episode as a kid with my dad on the Sci-Fi Channel. But in the version that I rewatched here, which is on Paramount Plus, there's a voiceover where Spock lays out this is a divided society built on basically lies. It's a clumsy technique, but that's what is happening in the episode. Back on the Enterprise, McCoy finds out that the reason the Troglodytes have lower intelligence and less emotional restraint is because Xenite, in its raw form, emits a gas. It's odorless, tasteless, completely invisible, etc., etc. But it dampens human and humanoid intellectual and cognitive capacities. And so, because the Troglodytes are continually exposed to this gas, their intellectual abilities are stunted. But, luckily enough, it is a temporary effect. And so, if a Troglodyte is removed from the mines, the way that Vana was when she was brought to Stratos City to be a maid or something, then the effect of that wears off. But when they go back to the mines, back into that gas, the same negative impacts occur. So, what the Enterprise crew realizes is if they just have a filter mask, there you go, problem solved. They're no longer exposed to that gas, and the filter masks are fairly cheap and easy for the Federation to manufacture, so they could distribute them literally to all of the Troglodytes and the Stratos City dwellers. Everybody can go do some work, and everybody can enjoy life in the clouds, and it can be an equitable society, but the rub is that both Placis and Vana are basically like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. you're making up nonsense to get what you want. And so neither of them believe Kirk. Until Kirk, who is basically kidnapped by Vana after he helps rescue her from Strato City, she takes him hostage, forces him to dig Xenite, then he gets a hold of his phaser, blasts the tunnel entrance, so they get caved in, and then he has Spock and Scotty transport Placis from Strato City down into the mine. Kirk makes both Placis and Vana dig, and eventually Placis and Kirk get real violent and start basically fist fighting one another to the death. And Vana's like, oh fuck, that's the gas you were talking about that I totes didn't believe you about before. So she gets a hold of Kirk's communicator, calls Spock. Spock beams everybody up. And then the episode ends with Placis and Kirk still not really pleased, but the Federation is going to mediate between the Strato City Council and the Troglodytes. Alongside all of this, Spock is kind of having a thing with Droxine, who's Placis' daughter. She's an interesting kind of character because initially she's very much in the same camp as Placis, of like, no, the Troglodytes are inferior. We don't need to sort of consider their perspective. They're just physically and cognitively incapable of appreciating art and abstract concepts and things like this. But over the course of the episode, she starts to say maybe what we think is wrong. Maybe we're not right. And she actually does challenge her father before he gets transported out of Strato City. Are we so sure that we're right that we never question what we believe? And that's actually a remarkably difficult step for people to take when interrogating their own beliefs very often. So, I mean, fair play to her for that. So, there's several social justice thematics at work here. One, of course, is workers' rights. That's a really central one to this. And of course, in 1969, when this episode came out, in the US, union membership was still quite high. Starting really from the late 40s through the 50s and 60s, union membership was very, very high. The high water mark, really, of union membership in the US. And because of that, working conditions were comparatively quite good. Now, there were still issues, particularly things that we now know as like unsafe chemicals and substances and things like this that we didn't know in the 60s were unsafe. But comparatively, labor rights were quite well secured. And that is compared to both, say, the 1920s and before, where labor rights were very, very unsecure, and where labor conditions were often very, very bad, but also even compared to today, where wages have basically started stagnating when union membership started declining in the early 70s. We're now seeing a very bizarre push for allowing child labor back in the US. Generally, working conditions have substantially declined, particularly picking up from the 80s when the neoliberal revolution begins with Reagan. So working conditions today are worse comparatively than they were in the 60s. So union membership was very, very popular. And the idea of a union as being the good guys, as being on the right side of the class struggle, would have been a very familiar perspective to many viewers in 1969 in a way that it isn't necessarily as much today, although we're seeing a resurgence of unions, thankfully. So that's the one element here. The fact that this is particularly rooted around mining, I think, is very significant because, again, West Virginia, I have this personal connection. My partner is from West Virginia, so she has this personal connection as well. The exploitation of miners, specifically, has been one of, I would say, one of the worst areas of labor history in the U.S. For reasons that I don't want to spend too much time in. I could probably talk about this extensively, but it's the treatment of miners in the U.S. has been, I would say, worse than the treatment of workers in most other industries. There's maybe some exceptions at some particular points in history, but across the board, I would say miners have had it worse than most other types of workers. And part of the reason is because safety in mines has been such a point of resistance for mine owners. In particular, something like black lung disease for a long, long time was denied by mine owners. And one of the reasons that they were able to get away with this is because really up until unions kind of broke up this trend, but there used to be what was called the company town, which was basically where the mining company owned everything. They owned the housing that most workers lived in. They owned the utilities, such as they were. They owned the store that workers could buy stuff from. They employed people. They often owned things like the school, the fire department, police, to a certain extent at least. And they often paid in what was called company scrip, which was company printed money that could only be used at the company store. They also owned the doctors. The company doctor was the person that you would see as a miner. And so while these company doctors knew that black lung was a thing, their jobs depended on denying the existence of this. So in the xenite gas that affects people, affects troglodytes without their knowledge, we have a kind of parallel of black lung disease, which, again, for so long was denied. The existence of it was denied in much the same way that, like, the fossil fuel industry denied the impact that their activities had on global climate change, even though they knew their own data proved that the burning of fossil fuels was detrimental to the environment in quite possibly irreversible ways. So there's an anti-capitalist element here in that sense as well. This sense that the capitalist class, which in this case is represented by the Strato City dwellers, who don't particularly produce anything of value to the society and yet are in charge, that they are able to exploit the labor of the troglodytes, who themselves have no recourse within this society. And that's what, of course, leads to them to violent revolution. The other element of this that I think is really interesting is, again, this is something that I probably wouldn't have thought of prior to 2020, but Placis and Vanna's resistance to the idea of filter masks, right? One of the things that we saw during the COVID pandemic, particularly here in the US, is vaccine hesitancy and anti-masking. This idea that, like, oh, the disease isn't real, or some bullshit like this, some idiocy that these people come up with, and then refuse to do something comparatively simple and non-harmful to you in order to benefit all of society. The reality is that societies that are more equitable function better across the board on virtually every metric of social health. Richard Wilkinson, Here, it's available here on YouTube. He has a really, really good TED Talk on this. By virtually every metric of social health, societies that are more economically equal, more financially equal, do better. Conditions are simply better. Plassas and Vana could have that. Ardana could have a more equitable society through the use of these filter masks, and yet there is resistance to this for not particularly good reasons. So there's a kind of link there with anti-masking and vaccine hesitancy, in which people refuse to do something that is actually beneficial for them because